Hello and welcome to the second lecture in my series on nicotine. Last time I talked a little bit about the natural and social history of tobacco, which is our source of nicotine, and I kind of ended up in roughly the modern time frame, so I want to pick up there and talk about current trends in nicotine use, including electronic cigarettes. I want to talk about current tobacco use, again focusing mostly on cigarettes as I did in my last lecture, because that's the major way that people use tobacco and get nicotine. Then I want to talk about some of the acute effects of tobacco and nicotine, specifically on the peripheral and central nervous systems. And then just to finish up, I'll talk a little bit about options for treatment for nicotine dependence. Okay, so current trends in tobacco use, or I guess I should say nicotine use. You've probably noticed in the last sort of 3 to 5 years the increased popularity, or at least the increased amount of advertisement for electronic cigarettes. Even in Fargo, North Dakota, where I live now, there are a couple stores open advertising vapor cigarettes or vaping. For those who are unfamiliar with this, you can certainly find no shortage of YouTube videos of people smoking electronic cigarettes. The way this works is you have a plastic tube with a heated element, or kind of a heating element that comes into contact with a liquid solution that contains nicotine and some other compounds, including some flavoring agents. The heating element heats that vapor to the point where heats that fluid to the point where it vaporizes. You inhale this vapor much as you would inhale the smoke from a cigarette, and you get the nicotine that way. So you're inhaling a vapor, not a smoke, and at least in principle this ought to be somewhat safer than smoking cigarettes. Although, to be perfectly honest, that's probably a poor standard for judging safety, because smoking cigarettes, at least in terms of their long-term outcomes, is just a very, very dangerous and unhealthy thing to do. And as we'll see in a couple more slides, there is some concern about the relative safety of electronic cigarettes. Most people would argue they're safer, but how much safer is not exactly known at this point. Anyway, these products were developed a few years back in China, and as I noted in my last slide, they're gaining popularity around the world, but including in the United States, and I guess I already talked about this as well. There's increasing concern about the safety of these products, especially for their safety as an alternative to smoking conventional cigarettes, and there's some interest in regulating them. In 2009, the FDA was able to classify electronic cigarettes as a drug delivery device, which gave them some authority to regulate how these products are marketed in the United States. It also gave the FDA the authority to require testing for nicotine levels in the solutions which are used inside the electronic cigarettes, and also allowed the FDA to require that manufacturers included warning labels about other carcinogenic compounds that are present in the fluids that are used in electronic cigarettes. So a little bit like what we saw with tobacco products, or at least cigarettes in the last lecture. With regards to electronic cigarettes, in this lecture you can see that the FDA was sort of granted more authority to regulate these products and could require manufacturers to both assure that nicotine is present in a certain amount within the product, and also that other compounds which may be dangerous are at least labeled as such. So I kind of addressed this issue before, but what's the safety of these products? Well, because they're not burning anything, there's no tar, and as we'll see later on in this lecture, the tar from tobacco smoke, tar being just a general term to refer to all the compounds in the smoke that comes off of a burning product, in that case burning cigarette. There's no tar in electronic cigarette vapor, so it ought to be a little bit safer on that count. There is nicotine present, and nicotine, while not tremendously dangerous in the quantities that people consume it in, does nonetheless have some adverse health effects. What's particularly concerning, though, about electronic cigarettes is they may have other stuff in the fluid that's used within them to generate the vapor that may be dangerous. And one compound in particular, formaldehyde, seems to be present at relatively high levels in the vapor from electronic cigarettes. Formaldehyde, which I'm sure almost all of us encountered in biology class back in high school, maybe when you did a dissection of an animal, is a compound which can be useful for preserving things, but can also be quite dangerous if you take it into your body. There's a certain amount of formaldehyde present in cigarette smoke, just regular conventional cigarette smoke. There seems to be some evidence, though, that there's more of it present in electronic cigarette vapor, which raises the possibility that these products, while maybe safer than smoking regular cigarettes, are still not particularly safe as compared to at least some other options that people have when they want to stop smoking cigarettes. Okay, so with that little bit of current trend in mind, let's look at the current use of tobacco, or the current rates of use of tobacco. And again, especially here, we're focusing on cigarettes. If we look at the data for monitoring the future up to the last year, up to 2014, you can see that in general there is significant use of cigarettes among adolescents, although that use is declining and has been declining for about a decade or two. You can see, if we look here at the percentage of people who've used a cigarette within the last 30 days, so these are sometimes called current users, if not regular heavy users, they're at least current users, someone who's tried a cigarette sometime in the last month or so. At a high point in the 1990s, about the time I was graduating from high school, upwards of 40% of high school seniors had used cigarettes within the last 30 days. Now it's less than half of that in 2014, or slightly after 2014. You can also see that the availability, or at least the perceived availability of cigarettes, is quite high, but that too has been declining over time. Back in the day, cigarettes were fairly easy to get, at least in my own experience, and certainly in the experience of people who are of a certain age. They're more difficult to get these days. That perceived availability has dropped off quite a bit and kind of tracks along with the actual reported use of these products over the last couple decades. Also, for monitoring the future, there are questions that address the perceived risk of using cigarettes and the sort of disapproval of using cigarettes. And here, the questions ask about smoking a pack a day or more. So how risky is being a regular, rather heavy smoker? The perceived riskiness of that has kind of crept up over the years, and now upwards of 80% of high school seniors report that that's a pretty risky thing to do, and there's a fairly high level of disapproval of smoking that heavily. So as time has gone by in the last few decades, the attitudes about this drug, that is nicotine in tobacco, especially smoked cigarettes, have changed. Attitudes have changed such that this behavior is seen as generally more risky, generally less willing or less deserving of approval, and perhaps as a consequence, people's actual use has declined during that time period. So a few more numbers here for monitoring the future. If we look at past 30-day use, you can see here that depending on the exact year we look at, it's something like less than 20% of high school seniors are using cigarettes within the last 30 days. If we look at daily use, those numbers are even smaller. So who are the people who are daily users of cigarettes? Still small, much smaller, although not tremendously small. I mean, 8% of high school seniors is still a lot of people, and daily use of cigarettes, especially at a young age, is certainly something that might concern, or should concern, I suppose, any of us, whether we're friends, family members, parents, teachers, etc. Recently, the Monitoring the Future group released some data from their most recent surveys, which concern 2015, and I couldn't get any images for you of graphs for trends over time. Those weren't loading on their website for some reason, but I could get from a table some basic numbers. If you can see here, for the past 30-day use, that is, have you used any cigarettes within the last 30 days? The rates are low. They're even a little bit lower than the last survey for 2014, and you can see that also in the rates of daily use, which are again quite low. One thing I did notice on the Monitoring the Future website is they have a press release. They actually have many press releases, but one of them concerns tobacco use, and they're noting that tobacco use by young people, high school and junior high age people, is actually at the lowest level that it's been in many, many decades. So we're seeing kind of a continuing downward drift that you saw probably in some of those previous graphs of trends over time, reflecting the idea that as years go by, fewer and fewer young people are choosing to smoke cigarettes, which from a public health standpoint and from a financial standpoint and probably from many standpoints is a very good thing. If we look at the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, and this is data from just the year 2013, so it's slightly out of date right now, we can see that there are generally higher rates of use among young adults. So if you're in your early 20s or in that kind of sweet spot for drug use from about 21 to 25, the rates of people who report using cigarettes within the past month are quite a bit higher. 30-40% of folks in that age range are cigarette smokers. Again, we see that for a lot of drugs. That's kind of a peak level for drug use, or I should say a peak age for drug use. And then those rates decline when we look at older folks. Although there's an interesting bump you can see kind of in the 40 to 50-year-old range, and that may reflect essentially legacy smokers, people who began smoking, back in the day in the 50s and 60s when it was just frankly more common to smoke. So just to kind of focus on a number again, if we look at the National Survey of Drug Use and Health from 2013, the past 30-day use for all people who are age 12 or older is about 20% or 21%. So about 1 in 5 people will have used cigarettes at least once within the last 30 days. That's a fairly large number if you think about the entire population of America, and also a concerning number or a concerning percentage if you think about the risks associated with this behavior. And here's just a graph that kind of pulls out that same number and sort of pushes it back over time. The number here is actually slightly different than the one on the previous slide, but you can see that essentially, well, actually it's about the same. If you look at only cigarettes, it's about 20%. If you look at all tobacco products, the percentage is a little bit higher. And you can see that cigarette use has declined in terms of the percentage of the overall population who uses slowly over the last approximate decade. It's interesting to note, though, that other forms of tobacco use, like cigars and smokeless tobacco and even pipe tobacco, have remained relatively steady during that same period. So this may reflect how we have changing attitudes around smoking cigarettes as being more risky, less deserving of approval. Those attitudes may not be changing as much for these other forms of tobacco use. This is just a graph, a map with somewhat old data. Again, this dates back to 2009. I haven't seen an update of this graph recently, but the reason I'm pulling it out here is just to highlight that kind of high-risk age range. You can see here I've selected for people who report smoking every day within the age range of about 18 to 35, and you can see there is some geographic variability in the areas of relatively heavy smoking for that high-risk group and relatively light smoking for that high-risk group. What's also interesting, though, is if you change the settings on this map, I'll see if I can find this and link to it on Blackboard, and ask, what about smoking at least sometimes? Are you someone who doesn't smoke every day, but you smoke at least occasionally, and you're in that age range of 18 to 35? We see quite prevalent patterns of this behavior. It's quite common around the country to find people in the 18 to 35 range. Greater than 20% of people in different states in that age range will report smoking at least some time. People who study tobacco use, especially smoking, call these folks chippers, and I'm honestly not sure where this name came from. But the idea, I think, is that if you're someone who sort of chips at a cigarette pack, you don't smoke a whole pack every day, you just smoke 1 or 2 cigarettes a day, or maybe less, or you only smoke when you're out with your friends drinking, or you only smoke when you're out, well, not in a coffee shop anymore, but out like doing some work, and you want to step outside the coffee shop to have a cigarette, then you might be identified by a researcher as a chipper. And these folks are kind of interesting to us because, again, by definition, they're occasional users, and they seem to be fairly specific in terms of the places and the settings in which they do the behavior in which they smoke. There's even some suggestion that they're not exactly dependent on nicotine the way most smokers are. Most people who are regular smokers are almost certainly going to be diagnosable as nicotine dependent. They show patterns of tolerance, they show patterns of withdrawal, they fit the criteria that I've talked about in previous lectures for dependence. People who are chippers don't seem to fit that mold, and they're unusual because nicotine seems to be a fairly addictive drug for most people. It's possible that some folks who are chippers are now going to go on to become heavy smokers in time, or at least regular smokers in time. But there does seem to be a pattern of people who were smokers and sort of dialed it back and became chippers, and there are even some people who sort of maintain their status as a chipper for long periods of time without becoming regular cigarette users. There's a fair bit of research on these folks, and I just find them kind of interesting because they sort of defy, I think, our expectations about what smokers should be like. And I'll pull out a little bit and highlight it on Blackboard, I think. This is just a graph from one of the articles. It actually dates back to 1989, so again, it's a bit old, but it highlights, I think, an interesting point here. It's when we compare people who are chippers in the white bars to people who are dependent smokers, that is to say regular smokers who are sort of smoke every day and would meet criteria for being dependent or addicted to nicotine. We compare these two groups on their motivations for smoking. There are various questionnaires that will assess people's self-reported reasons for why they smoke. We find that the people who are chippers and the people who are regular smokers report roughly similar levels of psychosocial motivations for smoking. So both groups will say things like, well, I smoke to relax, or I smoke because it helps me cope with stress, or I smoke because my friends smoke and it's a way for us to socialize, or I smoke because it's a way to meet people. When you're out at an event, if you smoke, you're going to meet other smokers. Those are psychosocial motivations, and people who are chippers in the white bar and dependent smokers in the brown or gray bar, they're reporting roughly similar levels of those motivations. What seems to be different, though, is that the chippers report lower levels of pharmacological motivation, meaning things like, I smoke because if I stop smoking, I'll go into withdrawal and I will feel irritable, or I'll feel confused or sort of lightheaded and uncomfortable. Those pharmacological reasons that people choose to smoke are more commonly endorsed by people who are dependent smokers, no surprise, than they are by people who are chippers. So again, these folks seem a little different. They're an interesting group. I'll highlight some of the research that's on chippers on Blackboard, but I thought it was worth mentioning them just now because there are a fair number of chippers in college populations, as you saw, I think, in that previous map that I showed. Anyway, let's move on. What are some of the acute effects of tobacco? And here, I'm going to briefly talk about tobacco generally, or at least smoked tobacco and cigarettes, and then I'm going to really drill down and focus on just nicotine. Well, let's first think about nicotine in terms of how it's administered to the body. In the form of cigarettes, of course, it's inhaled. In the form of smokeless tobacco, things like snuff or chewing tobacco, or various nicotine lozenges which can be applied or it can be used. These are all allow for absorption of nicotine through the oral tissues, through your gums, your throat, etc. Nicotine absorbs quickly into the body, especially if it's inhaled in smoke. It's essentially somewhat water soluble. It's miscible in water, meaning it can kind of distribute in water fairly easily. It becomes more water soluble if the tobacco that the nicotine comes from has been treated with ammonia. Manufacturers of tobacco products, especially cigarettes, often treat the tobacco with ammonia because it kind of changes the texture of the product, makes it easier to work with. It also helps the nicotine to form a stable freebase molecule. This is in a way analogous to freebasing cocaine, essentially making cocaine, changing the properties of cocaine to make it more easy to smoke and inhale. If you freebase nicotine, you sort of change the chemical structure of it to sort of lock a base group in so it forms a stable salt. It vaporizes at a different temperature. It also dissolves in water much more easily. So bottom line, you get faster absorption from this treated nicotine than you do from regular old untreated nicotine. And most cigarette manufacturers use these type of processes because it allows them to kind of amp up the nicotine levels, so to speak, in their products, making them more pleasurable or more effective and certainly more addictive. Nicotine distributes evenly in the body. As your text notes, it crosses the blood-brain barrier maybe 10 seconds after inhalation. At least I think your text notes that. I actually have a bunch of books open on my desk in front of me. I forget whether this is in your text or one of the other pharmacology books that I have. But essentially, from that first smoke, that first puff of cigarette smoke, it's a very short period of time to when the nicotine is actually crossing the blood-brain barrier into your brain, and a pretty short time until you have peak levels of nicotine in your blood, maybe as little as 10 minutes. Nicotine is metabolized by the liver, like most other drugs that we're going to talk about. It has a somewhat variable half-life. It can be sort of 1 to 2 hours of time for folks. As I discussed in my previous lecture, for folks who are African American, it's often a longer time because some African Americans have genes that code for a slightly different version of an enzyme, making the whole metabolism process somewhat less efficient for them, meaning that the nicotine stays around in their system longer. As I also noted in my previous lecture, this metabolism or this metabolic process is inhibited somewhat by menthol. So if you're smoking mentholated cigarettes, you can have stronger, longer lasting nicotine effects. One, because you may just draw the smoke in more deeply into your lungs because the menthol makes your lungs feel pleasant and cool. It's easier to smoke. That gets you more nicotine in the first place, but also because menthol will sort of slow down your body's metabolism of nicotine, leaving more nicotine lingering for longer in your system. Okay, so nicotine is one of the molecules that enters the body when you smoke tobacco cigarettes, and there actually are a very great many other molecules which also enter the body, a whole raft of which we collectively call tar, which are the molecules which are carcinogenic in the lungs and elsewhere in the body. In addition to that, there's also carbon monoxide, a molecule that you're probably familiar with if your house or your apartment has a carbon monoxide detector, or if you were ever advised to be careful about leaving your car running in garages or enclosed areas because carbon monoxide can build up. You probably know this is a deadly gas. The reason it's deadly is carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin, which is the molecule on your red blood cells, which binds normally to oxygen, allowing red blood cells to carry oxygen around your body. The problem is that hemoglobin has a higher binding efficiency for carbon monoxide than it does for oxygen. So your red blood cells will tend to preferentially pick up carbon monoxide over oxygen in your lungs if you're smoking cigarettes or otherwise in contact with carbon monoxide. Basically, this has the effect of decreasing the oxygen exchange in your lungs, decreasing the oxygen level in your body. Your body responds by elevating your heart rate so as to better circulate the blood with what little oxygen is available in it. So basically, it puts strain on your heart from the carbon monoxide present in cigarette smoke. Elsewhere in the peripheral nervous system, nicotine has effects on the body. Nicotine, generally speaking, stimulates acetylcholine receptors throughout the body, and acetylcholine is usually an excitatory neurotransmitter, meaning that when it is secreted in the different systems that use it as a neurotransmitter, it generally has the effect of increasing activity of those systems. So throughout the body, especially sort of in the periphery of the body, acetylcholine acts to increase various sympathetic nervous system responses. Nicotine binds to one of the types of acetylcholine receptors and activates those receptors, thus kind of triggering this activating or stimulating effect. And for that reason, we could, if we wanted to, class nicotine as a stimulant. It has some of the same effects that we associate with other stimulant drugs, like caffeine, or indeed like more powerful stimulants, such as amphetamine. So if we look in the periphery, we see in the gastrointestinal system, nicotine has the effect of generally slowing the gastrointestinal system, slowing the smooth muscle action that sort of allows your stomach to digest food and your small intestines to absorb nutrients from food. This may be part of the reason why nicotine acts as an appetite suppressant. If you're hungry, one of the cues of hunger is the kind of rumbling in your stomach. Nicotine will calm that somewhat and will tend to decrease your sense of appetite, which is why one reason why people sometimes smoke or use nicotine-containing products, that is, as an appetite suppressant. Elsewhere in the periphery, nicotine stimulates the release of adrenaline from your adrenal glands. Adrenaline circulates throughout your blood system, and among its other effects will tend to increase your heart rate. So there's kind of a double effect of smoking cigarettes. Your heart rate increases because of the carbon monoxide present in cigarette smoke. It also increases because of the effects that nicotine has in the periphery. Nicotine also acts on the musculature of the heart itself and on the circulatory system. It generally has the effect of causing constriction of blood vessels, which increases blood pressure. This is obvious, or probably is obvious, if you're pumping a given volume of fluid through a series of pipes and you then narrow those pipes, the pressure goes up. That's analogous to what happens in your circulatory system, and this further puts strain on the heart. So one of the reasons why we see that nicotine is associated with long-term health risks, including cardiac health risks, is it generally stresses your heart through a variety of different mechanisms. I mentioned that nicotine decreases blood flow by constricting vessels. This has some effects, especially in the periphery. So if you see people who are very heavy smokers or regular smokers, you sometimes see that they'll have sort of cold hands, or you'll sometimes see in really heavy smokers the nail beds of their nails will seem kind of pale, like there's just not as much blood circulating to the extremities of their fingers or of their toes. Also, interestingly, for people who smoke cigarettes, or at least for men who smoke cigarettes heavily and for long periods of time, decreased blood flow to the penis can result in increased rates of impotence. So obviously, to achieve an erection, if you're a man, you need a certain amount of blood flow to the penis. If you're a heavy smoker and if you've been smoking for a long time, that decreased blood flow can make it more difficult for you to have a good erection. So there's actually a fair bit of research on rates of impotence among smokers, smoking males, as compared to non-smokers. So some of these effects that we're noticing, things like decreased stomach activity, increased heart rate, sort of constriction of blood vessels, decreased blood flow to the extremities, these are all generally consistent with a sympathetic nervous system response, the kind of fight or flight response. Now, there are certainly times in your life when it's good to have this type of response. If you're under threat of danger, or if you're trying to escape from some sort of peril, to have increased blood pressure and heart rate is a good thing. To have decreased stomach activity is also good, because you're not wasting energy digesting food if you're trying to escape from danger. To have decreased blood flow to the extremities can be good, because if you're injured, you don't bleed out as quickly. Your body has these type of responses for a reason, or at least evolution has crafted a series of responses that fit certain situations that you or other living beings may be in. Drugs like nicotine can activate these same responses, but to the extent that people smoke a lot, people who smoke daily and they smoke a lot, you can have a kind of a sustained sympathetic nervous system response in the periphery over long periods of time, which can over time just wear down the body, causing damage to the heart, causing damage to the digestive systems and the gastrointestinal system, also causing damage to elsewhere, to the extremities. So this raises an interesting question, I think, which is, are cigarettes relaxing? Now, if you talk to people who smoke, or if you yourself have ever smoked cigarettes, you probably say, well, of course they're relaxing. Smoking a cigarette, maybe after a meal, or after having sex, or after doing whatever, often feels like a nice way to step back and relax. It's odd to think, though, that people report this type of feeling, or report that smoking is relaxing, given that it does things like increasing heart rate, decreasing stomach activity, etc. Why is something that stimulates you also something that feels relaxing? Well, part of the answer may be that nicotine doesn't affect all parts of your periphery the same way. It actually causes changes in the activation of your skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscles are, for the most part, the muscles which you have voluntary conscious control over. So if you sort of reach to pick up a cup of coffee, or you stand up and walk across the room, it's your skeletal muscles accomplishing those movements. Nicotine, when it activates nicotinic acetylcholine receptors in your skeletal muscles, will cause kind of a twitching response, or kind of a sort of pattern of firing which is not particularly efficient, which will have the overall effect of decreasing your muscle tone. So subjectively this may feel like kind of a relaxing sensation as your muscles kind of relax out a bit. So that may be part of why people associate with smoking with relaxation, or would tell you that when they smoke they feel relaxed. Another reason that has less to do with physiology and maybe more to do with basic psychology is that smoking is often associated through pairing with taking a break from work, or having just accomplished something important, or having just done some other nice relaxing thing. So having a nice meal or having sex, those are things that are naturally, for most people I suppose, enjoyable, or nice things to have accomplished. So to the extent that you pair a cigarette with those behaviors, the act of smoking the cigarette has some of the associated feelings of those behaviors. And obviously taking a break from work, or stopping on the side of the road at a rest stop if you're on a long car ride, those are moments in your life when you're relaxing or taking a break from whatever it is you're doing. To the extent that you pair those moments with smoking a cigarette, over time the cigarette acquires some of that feeling of being relaxing, even if in some ways nicotine, at least, and carbon monoxide and some of the other stuff in cigarette smoke isn't per se particularly relaxing to your body, or at least relaxing to all of the parts of your body. So again, it's an interesting almost paradox where nicotine and carbon monoxide, but especially nicotine, look like they ought to not be very relaxing for your body, but in some ways they are, and there are probably some good reasons for that. So let's shift our focus from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. And here we see that nicotine stimulates acetylcholine receptors in the brain. Acetylcholine receptors are rather broadly distributed through a variety of different systems in your body, both in your peripheral nervous system and in your central nervous system, which may explain why when you smoke a cigarette and nicotine starts to affect your body, it affects a lot of different things. It doesn't just work in one place in your body. So among its other effects, some of the acetylcholine systems will themselves connect to norepinephrine systems, and increased activity in acetylcholine systems and increased activity in norepinephrine systems generally produces increased alertness and increased subjective sense of concentration or mental focus. This may be why, at least historically in the 20th century, many famous writers were pictured smoking cigarettes as they write or review their work. There's a picture of Albert Camus, who's probably my favorite author, who is almost always seen smoking a cigarette dangling out of the side of his mouth, very Humphrey Bogart style. I remember back when I was in college, when you could smoke in dorm rooms, if you can believe that, I would stay up at night drinking coffee, smoking cigarettes, and writing my term papers, often hours before they were due. Often trying to hang my cigarette off the side of my mouth to look super cool that way. or what at the time I thought was super cool. Anyway, I mean, there's some reason why nicotine can help the process of writing, at least maybe, and that is that it stimulates a kind of a level of alertness, provides a level of mental focus, which can be helpful to you if you're trying to do a task which is tedious or challenging. Nicotine stimulates acetylcholine receptors that also those the systems which also interact with systems in the dopamine reward pathway. So there are acetylcholine receptors that are part of systems which interact with dopamine systems in the nucleus accumbens and other parts of that mesolimbic dopamine pathway, which may explain why smoking cigarettes can be so addictive. They're addictive in part because they provide these pleasant experiences, which people tend to like. They're addictive in part because there are withdrawal symptoms associated with not smoking, and we'll talk about those in a few more slides. They're addictive in part because they have a connection to that basic reward pathway, which tends to make behaviors which activate the pathway things that you want to repeat. So whether they're things like eating a pleasant meal or having sex or escaping danger, things that you've evolved to want to do and want to do again and again, or whether drugs are activating those pathways, you get that same kind of compulsive like urge to do the behavior again and again. And for people who smoke cigarettes, that compulsive urge feels kind of like a craving, like, ooh, it'd be nice to smoke cigarettes right now. I must say, even though it's been over a decade since I last smoked a cigarette, and even though I've never really was a heavy smoker, just doing this lecture right now and the lecture prior to it, seeing all these pictures of people smoking, triggers in me a kind of an urge, like, oh gosh, it would be nice to smoke. It'd be nice to have a cigarette. And it's not an urge I'm going to cave into and bow to, but it's one that I experience. Probably a testament to the power of nicotine as an addictive substance. With that in mind, let's talk a little bit about nicotine dependence. Let's ask the question, why do most smokers get addicted? There may be some people who are chippers, who don't ever become so invested in the behavior that they would meet diagnostic criteria for dependence or addiction. But most people who smoke end up getting addicted sooner or later. Why is that? Well, like I said before, there are reward pathways, there are mesolimbic dopamine pathways. Here I'm kind of highlighting the nucleus accumbens, which is just part of that pathway. It's not the only part or even the most important part, but generally anything, any behavior, whether it's taking drugs or doing something else that activates that pathway, will tend to feel rewarding to a person subjectively, and will tend to be associated with a craving to repeat or a craving for repetition. So if you're hungry right now, I'm a little bit hungry. It's right before my lunch. You're looking at this picture of these delicious looking cupcakes, and there's probably a certain urge that you're feeling, or a certain urge that I'm feeling, of like, oh, that'd be really good. It seems important to have one of those cupcakes, at least more important than a lot of the other stuff in my environment. That subjective feeling that like, that would be good, I should go do that, I should go get that. That's the feeling of the dopamine reward pathway. And really many rewarding behaviors, as I've said before, things like eating and having sex and escaping from danger, those things all use this pathway. That's what this pathway in a sense was designed for. But drugs, at least all drugs which we think of as being at all addictive, in some way activate this pathway, and nicotine is no exception to that. And I'll link to a video that goes into a little bit more detail as to how nicotine interacts with the reward pathways. Another reason why people get addicted to nicotine, or a related reason, are all the environmental cues associated with smoking. Smoking is something that people do a lot. If you're a cigarette smoker and you smoke even half a pack a day, that's 10 cigarettes. That's a lot of smoking. That's a lot of time spent smoking if you really think about all the minutes. And anytime you're smoking or getting ready to smoke or buying a pack of cigarettes or unwrapping them, etc., whether you realize it or not, your brain is making connections, associations with other things in your environment that are going on at about the same time. So if you're drinking a cup of coffee when you're smoking a cigarette, or if you're sitting down to write a term paper and you're smoking a cigarette, or if you're doing whatever it is you're doing with your cigarette, those cues, those aspects of your environment, all those stimuli that make up those different things in your environment become associated with the behavior, and later on can serve as triggers to activate craving. So for instance, I used to, as many people, who smoked, I used to drink alcohol and smoke cigarettes at the same time. Again, this was back when you could do that at bars, which is amazing for me to think about now, like how smoky bars used to be. It was disgusting. Like you would have to come home and take a shower after going to a bar because there'd be so much smoke in your hair. If you didn't, you'd wake up in the morning, your pillow would just smell like an ashtray. It was gross. But anyway, I guess I contributed to that. I was one of those people who was at the bar, drinking and smoking with my friends in the 1990s and later. And for years later, even now, when I drink alcohol, when I buy a glass of beer or a glass of wine at the bar or the restaurant, there's some small part of me that wants a cigarette as well because those things were associated. I used to drink coffee and smoke cigarettes when I was writing term papers or doing data analysis in grad school and actually also as an undergrad. Now when I have coffee, I often want a cigarette, and it's been literally many years, a decade or more since I was last a smoker. But I have those associations, and they linger in my mind, as they do in the mind of many smokers. As I said in the last slide, smoking is associated with a lot of behavior. Some drugs people use, once, and then they're good for several hours. So if you take heroin or you take methamphetamine, you can experience the effect of that drug use over a period of time that may stretch into a couple hours or more. If you take LSD, the effects of that drug may last 8, 10, even 12 hours, depending on the strength of the LSD and some other factors as well. Smoking is different. Nicotine has a relatively short half-life, maybe an hour or so. People who smoke a lot because as nicotine levels fall in their system and as the effects of that drug subside, they start to feel a bit cranky, they start to feel a bit of a lack of mental focus, and they start to feel a craving to smoke again. So a typical cigarette smoker may smoke an awful lot in any one day. I mean, you figure one pack of cigarettes has 20 cigarettes. I'm just sort of guesstimating here that takes maybe 10 puffs of smoking to burn down one cigarette. You can think of essentially 200 puffs a day for someone who's a pack-a-day smoker. That's a lot of behavior. And people who study basic learning processes in psychology will tell you that simply repeating anything, regardless of what the behavior is, a lot, tends to instantiate it in your mind as a habit. Of course, many people use this phenomenon to worthwhile ends. If you're trying to get into the habit of exercising, you might just force yourself to go repeatedly for a stretch of time just to kind of build the strength in that habit. Or if you're trying to learn to improve your golf swing or your tennis swing, you might just repeat the behavior again and again and again, mindlessly, in a sense, repeating it, not really mindlessly, but so as to kind of establish the habit of movement. Similar thing can be happening if you're smoking. You're just repeating those same behaviors of pulling out the cigarette, firing it up, puffing, flicking it, throwing it away, putting the pack back in your pocket or whatever. Those behaviors are repeated so frequently every day that it's very easy for your mind to develop habits around them. So that's probably also one of the reasons why people, at least most people who smoke, become addicted. Now, a related idea that I wanted to touch on, and I kind of was thinking about where to put it in this lecture, is what's called the titration hypothesis. And this applies to nicotine. It also applies to other drugs as well. And the basic idea of the titration hypothesis is people who are nicotine dependent will repeat their nicotine behavior, let's say smoking cigarettes or you're dipping chewing tobacco or whatever it is, until their body achieves a certain level of nicotine. And then they'll stop. Their body is essentially craving a certain level of nicotine and using the behaviors as a way to get that nicotine. And there's some interesting research that kind of suggests that people, whether they realize it or not, are kind of dosing themselves up with nicotine when they're smoking. So for instance, if you give someone a pack of light cigarettes, or if you give someone who is a smoker of regular cigarettes, that is to say not kind of reduced not allegedly light cigarettes, cigarettes which have sort of full strength tobacco in them. and then you sort of surreptitiously give them a pack of light cigarettes, the person will tend to puff more and smoke more deeply than they would with their regular cigarettes. Or conversely, if you take someone who smokes a relatively light blend of tobacco in their cigarettes and give them, without their realizing it, a relatively heavy cigarette, sort of a thick cigarette with a lot more tobacco or a richer grade or more nicotinic grade of tobacco, that person, whether they notice it or not, will tend to smoke fewer puffs so as to get, sort of dial in that right level of nicotine. This is actually one of the reasons why nicotine replacement therapy as a treatment for nicotine dependence is successful. So if you give someone nicotine gum, or if you give someone a nicotine patch, these are ways of providing nicotine into the body, the person will tend to smoke less, either smoking fewer cigarettes or even just smoking fewer puffs of each cigarette, even if they don't realize it. Even if you tell them the gum that they're chewing is a placebo that actually contains no nicotine, or you tell them, lying to them, that the patch that you've put on them is actually not a nicotine patch, it contains no nicotine, they still will tend to smoke less, suggesting that their body is seeking a certain level or a certain titration of nicotine. And we see this with smoking behavior. It's been well studied there. Arguably, it occurs with other drugs as well. So we've been talking about dependence, addiction to nicotine. It's important to talk about tolerance and withdrawal. These are not the only reasons or the only criteria for dependence, but they're really two of the most important ones that we think of when we're trying to decide, is someone addicted or dependent to a particular drug. In the case of nicotine, there certainly are tolerance to the mood effects of nicotine. When people smoke initially, once they've first gotten over the difficulty of learning how to smoke cigarettes, early on in the smoking career that someone might have, some of the mood effects, the kind of general positive feeling that can accompany smoking, or the increased clarity or mental focus that can accompany smoking, is relatively strong and relatively rewarding. Over time, the acetylcholine receptors in the central nervous system adjust and kind of down-regulate to the presence of nicotine from regular smoking, and thus there's less of a dopamine activation for each cigarette smoked for the longer someone smokes. So the more you smoke, essentially the less pleasurable it becomes. And you hear this when you talk to people who smoke cigarettes, who've been smoking for a while. They'll say things like, when I first started smoking, I really wanted to smoke. I kind of liked the feeling, but now I no longer really want to smoke. It doesn't give me much pleasure. There's not as much positive reinforcement for this behavior as there used to be. But they'll say, I need to smoke. Again, I remember way back in the day, a friend of mine who's a pretty heavy smoker saying, I don't want to smoke. Nobody wants to smoke. We all need to smoke. And I think in a sense what he was referring to was this decreased positive reinforcement that had occurred in him because his brain, the acetylcholine receptors in his brain, especially those that interact with the dopamine systems, had become desensitized, they'd kind of down-regulated, they weren't responding as strongly to reward him for the behavior. But at the same time, he'd built up a fair dependence on the drug such that he was suffering withdrawal symptoms if he stopped smoking. And he was having negative reinforcement for smoking. So he essentially would feel bad if he stopped, so he kept on smoking. The behavior continued, it was reinforced, but it was reinforced via negative reinforcement rather than positive. Because indeed we see a strong pattern of withdrawal, or strong withdrawal symptoms, or a strong withdrawal syndrome among people who try and quit smoking. If you try to quit smoking, you have upset stomach, you have sort of dizziness and difficulty concentrating, you may have difficulty sleeping or relaxing. All the things that nicotine did for you and helped you with, now you have trouble with when you're in withdrawal. But of course, if you go back to smoking, if you somehow get nicotine in your body by going back to smoking cigarettes, that gets rid of those withdrawal symptoms. And thus the behavior continues via negative reinforcement, like I said on the last slide. Again, we sometimes call this physical dependence because a lot of the symptoms in this withdrawal syndrome are physical in nature, but that name's a bit misleading because it can involve more sort of psychological or subjective experiences too, like feeling irritable when you stop smoking. So let's say you're trying to quit and you're going through withdrawal for nicotine. What would that be like? Well, there's some variability, but for most people, in the first 6 hours or so, at least by the end of those 6 hours, pretty much all the nicotine has gone from your body. The half-life of nicotine is maybe 1 or 2 hours, double that to 4 hours or so. By 6 hours out, 5-6 hours out, the nicotine is gone from your body. It's been metabolized, and your blood pressure and your heart rate are going to start falling because there's no longer the nicotine boosting their activity levels. Within the first 24 hours after your last cigarette, some of those neurotransmitter systems, particularly the acetylcholine systems, will start to readjust to the fact that there's no longer nicotine present, and you may feel things like fatigue and difficulty concentrating and muscle aches and sleep problems, and I didn't put it on this slide, but gastrointestinal problems. Essentially the dark mirror image of some of the benefits that you were getting from nicotine. Nicotine helped you feel more alert and focused. When you're withdrawing, you feel fatigued and you have difficulty concentrating. Nicotine helped you feel kind of relaxed and in a good mood. When you're withdrawing, you feel irritable. Nicotine helped your muscles feel kind of loose and sort of at ease. When you have muscle aches when you stop smoking, etc. So kind of a classic withdrawal syndrome that sets up within the first 24 hours, and this is fairly unpleasant for most people. And with the opportunity to smoke again right there, it's easy for someone to quickly turn back to smoking, to reach for that pack of cigarettes. Now, in the weeks and months following your last cigarette, if you maintain abstinence, if you're able to successfully maintain your quit, you can still respond to cues related to smoking. And so people who are people who are ex-smokers, even as I said previously, myself, I'm someone who was never a very heavy smoker. I never smoked even half a pack a day. It was more like 5 or 6 cigarettes a day for on and off for several years in grad school and even earlier as an undergrad. Even now, I still respond to cues about smoking, like when I'm doing this lecture. An ashtray, a cigarette butt on the street, the whiff of cigarette, tobacco smoke in the air, pictures of cigarettes in my PowerPoint slide. All these things trigger for me a craving, and that's pretty typical for lots of people who are ex-smokers. People who used to smoke will sometimes report having thoughts or even dreams about smoking months, even years after they've stopped. So this all sounds kind of bad. Smoking is bad for you. You know that. I actually used to include in this lecture a whole raft of additional slides about some of the long-term negative effects of smoking, but I cut them out because this lecture is already getting pretty long. And also, I hope that you're well aware of the increased risks of cancer, emphysema, a variety of other problems associated with smoking. You don't need me to repeat them. Smoking's bad for you. You know that. Quitting is hard. The good news is there are some treatment options which may be helpful for folks. There are a variety of forms of counseling or psychotherapy or talk therapy that can be helpful for people who are trying to quit smoking or quit using other tobacco products or maintain their abstinence from these tobacco products. The different forms of therapy work in different ways. I'm not going to take a lot of time to get into the details right now, but suffice it to say that most of them work by helping people plan for quitting, make different behavioral changes in their lives so as to live a life that is tobacco-free, and also most successful forms of psychotherapy help clients to manage relapse, because we expect with people who are trying to quit smoking or quit using tobacco products that they will eventually relapse. And dealing with that relapse, responding in a positive way, not getting too discouraged, not giving up, those are things that good psychotherapy can help people with, so that when they fall off the wagon, so to speak, they don't just give up and go right back to smoking. They get back on the wagon, the horse, whatever that metaphor is, and continue their attempt at maintaining abstinence. There are some different pharmacological options for treatment for nicotine dependence. The most popular of these and the easiest to get is really nicotine replacement. They are now available either with a prescription or without, a variety of different things like patches, gum, inhalers, that provide nicotine to the body. Gum and inhalers work by allowing the user to get nicotine when they want it. Patches, of course, work by providing kind of a steady level of nicotine in the body over long periods of time. The way these work is they blunt the withdrawal syndrome, making the syndrome of withdrawing from nicotine a little bit easier to manage, so there's less negative reinforcement driving people back to using. They also help people titrate down their smoking. If you're getting a fair bit of nicotine in your system from your patch or your gum or your inhaler, you will smoke less. You'll smoke fewer cigarettes, you'll smoke fewer puffs on each cigarette. That's fairly helpful for most people who are trying to quit. By the way, I will say it's interesting that I mentioned electronic cigarettes back at the beginning of this lecture. Some of the manufacturers of electronic cigarettes and some of the advocates of electronic cigarettes have suggested that they represent a good way of getting nicotine replacement, a way to get nicotine without a lot of the carbon monoxide and tar associated with smoking a cigarette. I think there's probably some merit to this argument. However, as we discussed earlier, or as I discussed earlier, there may be some risks associated with vaping or using electronic cigarettes that may make them, relative to gum and patches and kind of medical inhalers, less safe as an alternative for nicotine replacement. There are other pharmacological options. One of them is Zyban or bupropion. Gosh, I always mangle those pharmacological names. A drug which you may be familiar with if you've ever heard of Wellbutrin, a fairly popular antidepressant. Zyban is the same chemical. It's just a different branding from the same manufacturers. And there is clinical research to suggest that using Zyban reduces craving for nicotine and also helps manage mood problems that may occur during withdrawal. So giving someone Zyban may help them feel less craving for nicotine and also may help them feel less irritable and anxious when they're in withdrawal, and thus will reduce the negative reinforcement for going back to smoking. Another option is Varenicline. Wow, I'm bad at this today. It's been a tough week. Anyway, Varenicline. I'll have to double check that pronunciation after I get done recording. More commonly known in this country as Chantix. Chantix is an interesting drug. It's a nicotine receptor partial agonist. So basically what it does is, like nicotine, it goes into the body and activates those nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. It just doesn't activate them quite as much as nicotine itself would. So, an antagonist is a molecule which fits into a receptor but blocks activation. An agonist is a molecule that fits into a receptor and promotes activation. A partial agonist is one that fits into a receptor and just kind of partially or at a less robust level stimulates activation. The reason why Chantix works, we think, is that it does provides some of the effects of nicotine, but not as strongly as nicotine itself, thus reducing somewhat your craving for the drug. Despite these, these options for treatment, the reality is that people who are trying to quit smoking or quit using other forms of tobacco, relapse is common for these folks. It depends on how you define a quit attempt or what type of criteria you use for scoring whether someone is successful at quitting or not. Like, are you a successful quitter if you've quit for a day, a month, a year, 10 years? I've looked online and found a variety of different data sources, but the common consensus is most people who try and quit smoking are going to relapse at least a few times. A key there can be getting good pharmacological treatment to manage withdrawal, and a good behavioral treatment or therapy to manage that relapse, so that there's the best opportunity or the best likelihood for that person to kind of get back up and try to quit again without getting discouraged and just giving up their effort. All right, well, that is a lot of material to cover about nicotine. I hope you've stuck with me. I know I've been a little bit off my game in these last two lectures. I feel like I've been rambling a bit and mispronouncing words a bit. It's been kind of a rough week for recording. I'm not sure exactly why. Coming up in my next lectures, I'll be talking about alcohol, another popular and interesting, legal, at least for most people, drug. So I hope you're looking forward to that. I'm actually really looking forward to those lectures. I like talking about alcohol. But until my next lecture, try and find some time to relax, take it easy, let some of this material sink in, read your textbook. If you have questions, as always, post them either in the comment area of YouTube or in the discussion boards on Blackboard. I'll do my best to respond to any questions that I see. So thanks so much for your attention, and I'll see you next time.